For Victims and Villains, my name is Josh. Today we are talking about Clive Barker Presents. I will put an emphasis on that. I will probably be the only person that introduces this movie as Clive Barker Presents Night of the Zoopocalypse. Clive Barker Presents Night at the Zoopocalypse tells the story of a group of misfit animals that encounter an alien invasion which causes an entire zoo around them to become undead monsters. I know the term gateway horror is often used as a film that essentially got you into the genre. When I think about it, I think of movies like this that are intended for younger audiences that are introducing elements of the genre to a younger generation than what you would probably see in like a Freddy or Jason movie. It's certainly been a while since we've gotten a original gateway horror concept that's meant for a younger generation. Now, in the last 10 to 20 years, we've kind of seen a revival in things that my generation grew up on, like Are You Afraid of the Dark reboot, as well as the two Goosebumps movies. But I think this one really does present something unique that neither one of those properties had. This film is kind of like the perfect gateway because there's enough here that feels modern and original for younger audiences, but it allows the older audiences that grew up on 80s and 90s horror to allow this as kind of the entry point into some of those movies. There's definitely a Night of the Living Dead aspect that is being paid homage to here. Plus, some of the music definitely sounds like that is like 80s synth music, the color palette, which I'll talk about in just a second. Just really, the vibe of this movie just feels like it's an 80s homage set in modern day. The animation here is really unique to explain because it does have this slick, not quite polished as you would find with a DreamWorks, Illumination, or Pixar. You could definitely kind of see that they were striving for that, but had a little bit of maybe budgetary restraints. And that's not a bad thing because the animation, though it is somewhat bulky, does have a really interesting quality to it. It's what feels like it's this blend of 3D animation that we go and we see now with the aforementioned Illumination and Pixar studios, but also kind of blending in this felt design that also kind of feels like an homage to some of the stop motion animation that you would find in either 80s or 90s. On top of it, there's this almost Lovecraftian vibe to the color palette. There are definitely a lot of sequences in the first act as it's kind of laying its foundation for what would ultimately become the insanity of the Zoopocalypse. That definitely has a color out of space vibe to it and visual representation. And I really loved the use of just really vibrant colors like the pinks, the purples, greens, blues. It just really works here. It also adds to the strangeness of this movie. Like, this movie is, when you kind of look at it and you hear about it at just a premise level, you're like, okay, that sounds like kind of a cool movie. And it just kind of gets progressively weirder. But again, I was here for it. I really loved how weird this movie got, both from a visual representation, but also from a narrative standpoint as well. I think one of the things that surprised me most about this movie was just how smart the writing in this movie was. But it's not right at the intro. Like, you definitely have to sit through it for an act. And the longer the movie progresses, the more meta it gets. It's a really weird to kind of explain, but it definitely feels like it has that DreamWorks Disney quality to it for the first act, where you're definitely kind of getting to know these characters. There's a little bit of predictable plot devices kind of littered throughout the first act as well as the climax, but once it kind of gets the ball rolling and it kind of becomes strange and weird, it has this meta quality to it that I really found charming and really witty. Gabby Cosmodias and David Harbour play the film's two leads. Again, just both of them just bring a unique flair that continues to bring in the greatness and the strangeness of this movie. Honestly, I love this kind of misfit character crew that we spend these 100 minutes with, because each one of them have their really own unique personality, and it just continues to add to just the overall atmosphere of what makes this movie both equal parts great and strange. If I had one problem about this movie, I would definitely probably argue that it's the pacing. There are definite moments of this where it definitely feels like this movie runs on a little bit too long, but those moments are fleeting compared to just how entertaining and how much fun this movie is overall. With that said, I am ready to run this one through our Rorschach rating scale. I am going to go ahead and give Clive Barker Presents Night of the Zoopocalypse a 4 out of 5. This is definitely going to go down as one of the hidden gems of this year. This movie is entertaining, it's daring, it's smart, it's witty, it's weird, it's funny. It's just an absolute blast. And on top of that, this is such a peak, great introduction for younger audiences to get interested into the horror genre. This is a great starting point. Clive Barker Presents The Night of the Zoopocalypse. See, I told you I was going to do it throughout the entirety of this video. It's now playing in limited release everywhere. But before we leave, let's talk about mental health, shall we? If you guys are new to our content here at Victims and Villains, we create content like what you're watching right now to talk about movies, but even more to ask the question, what do those movies teach us about mental health? So every video, right now, we take a moment to talk about what this movie teaches us from mental health, to destigmatize the stigma surrounding mental health. Honestly, I talked about this movie being such a great entry point into the horror genre for younger audiences, but I also think that this movie is a great vehicle to also kind of introduce the concept of the basics of mental health. So in this movie, there is a small asteroid that starts off and essentially affects a small rabbit, which then has this domino effect throughout the entirety of the zoo. And honestly, that's what it feels like to have mental health issues kind of start and go awry and wreak havoc in one's life. Typically, a larger mental health issue starts by a simple issue that is ignored and over time and eventually has the potential to balloon into, well, pretty significant proportions and even sometimes life-threatening diseases. And the other side of the sword is, because of the stigma surrounding mental health, depression, anxiety, we feel as though A, no one is going to understand what we're going through, and B, we also can't have these conversations because we feel like no one's going to listen or want to hear what we have to say. And the honest truth about that is that is nothing more than your depression deceiving you. And there are too many resources out there, too many warm lines, call lines, and organizations like ours, as well as communities that surround you that actually care about whether you make it from tonight until tomorrow. So please don't let your depression or your sadness kind of balloon into a apocalyptic or catastrophe to the way that the animals of this zoo allow this creature to eventually evolve. You matter. What you go through matters. What you think matters. What you have to say matters. One more time, Clive Barker Presents Night of the Zoopocalypse is now playing in limited release, so check your local listings. Go check out this movie. Or keep an eye on it for streaming if you can't make it out to the movies. This was a real delight. This was a real change. Hit that follow button and down below, and in the show notes below, not only will you find links to our mental health resource library, but you will find links to our upcoming events, social media, podcast network, and more movie reviews like what you're watching right now. So until next time, remember to keep it classy and keep it spooky. Have a good night.